Redditor 1. I've spent 20 years trying to convince myself that what I saw that night was just the product of an overactive child's imagination. But every time I visit my mother, I see the way her eyes dart nervously to the sky when we're in the driveway, and I know she remembers it too. She remembers everything. I was 9, maybe 10 when it happened. That detail gets fuzzy sometimes, but everything else remains crystal clear, burned into my memory like an afterimage that never quite fades. We were driving home from my Aunt Emily's house, taking the back roads through Pennsylvania farm country. Mom was behind the wheel, my little brother Tommy was passed out in his car seat, and I was pressed against the window, watching the cornfields roll by in the darkness. It was one of those autumn nights when the air feels sharp enough to crack, and the stars seemed closer than usual. The radio was playing softly, some adult contemporary station my mom always chose, and I remember thinking how the music made everything feel safe and normal, like we were in our own little bubble traveling through the night. That's when I first saw the red light. It appeared in the distance, hovering above the tree line. At first, I didn't think much of it. We lived in the flight path of a regional airport, and I was used to seeing aircraft lights in the night sky. But there was something different about this one. The color wasn't quite right. Not the steady red of airplane warning lights, but something deeper, more. "Mom," I said, but she was focused on the road, humming along to the radio. We turned onto Millbrook Road, the one that would take us home, and the trees swallowed up my view of the light. I remember feeling relieved, like maybe it had just been my imagination playing tricks on me. The street lights were few and far between out there, and the darkness had a way of making you see things that weren't really there. But then we passed the Anderson farm. The massive field opened up on our right, and there it was again, only this time it was close. So close I could see it wasn't just a light. It was something with lights. Something massive. "Mom," this time she heard the panic in my voice. "What is it, honey?" She glanced in the rearview mirror, probably thinking I was going to be carsick. "Look," I pressed my finger against the window, leaving a smudge that would stay there for weeks afterward. "The lights." She slowed the car slightly, peering through the windshield. That's when the radio started to crackle, the soft music dissolving into static that rose and fell like breathing. Tommy stirred in his car seat, making that whimpering sound that usually preceded a full-blown tantrum, but he didn't wake up. Looking back, I'm grateful for that small mercy. The trees closed in again as we made the final turn onto our driveway, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. The porch light was on, casting its familiar yellow glow across the gravel. Dad had left it on for us, just like always. Our house stood dark and quiet, waiting. Mom put the car in park, and that's when we both saw it. It was hovering directly above our house, maybe 100 feet up, a massive disc, easily as wide as our entire property, spinning slowly in the night air. The red light I'd seen earlier was just one of many now blues, greens, yellows, all pulsing in a pattern that made my eyes hurt when I tried to follow it. But the strangest part was the silence. Something that big should have made some kind of noise, a hum, a whoosh. Anything. Instead, there was nothing but the soft tick-tick-tick of our cooling engine and Tommy's steady breathing from the back seat. The porch light suddenly flared, becoming painfully bright, along with every other outdoor light on our property. The security light above the barn, the solar-powered garden lights along the walkway, even the little LED on our mailbox. All of them blazing like miniature suns. I remember Mom's hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles went white. She didn't scream, she didn't say a word. She just stared up through the windshield, and I watched her face change in the reflected light from above. Red, blue, green, yellow. It must have lasted only a minute, maybe less, but time felt strange, stretched out like taffy. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the craft began to move. It drifted sideways, smooth as silk, passing over our barn and heading toward the woods behind our property. As it moved away, the outdoor lights dimmed back to normal, and the radio's static cleared up, returning to the soft music as if nothing had happened. "Inside," Mom said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now." We got Tommy out of his car seat, he was still sleeping soundly, and hurried into the house. Dad was in his recliner, snoring slightly, the TV casting blue light across his face. Mom put Tommy to bed, and then we sat at the kitchen table, neither of us speaking, until the sun came up. We tried to talk about it the next day, but the words felt wrong somehow, inadequate to describe what we'd seen. Dad listened patiently when we told him, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't really believe us. Or maybe he didn't want to believe us. Tommy, of course, had no memory of it at all. Life went on. Weeks passed, then months, then years. I grew up, went to college, moved to the city. But I never forgot that night, and neither did Mom. The changes were subtle at first. The way she started checking the sky compulsively whenever she was outside after dark. The new security cameras she had installed around the property, all pointing upward. The weather radio she kept by her bed, always on, always listening. Then there were the dreams. They started about a year after that night. Vivid dreams of red lights and spinning discs, of time stretching like rubber bands, of something vast and incomprehensible trying to communicate in patterns of colored light. I still have them sometimes, especially when I'm stressed or overtired. But it's the other things that really get to me. The way my phone and laptop always seem to malfunction during certain times of the month, their screens flickering with patterns that look eerily familiar, the way animals go quiet when I walk past, their eyes following me with too much intelligence, the way I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, every light in my apartment blazing at full brightness, with no memory of turning them on. And then there are the marks. I first noticed them about 5 years ago. 3 perfect circles arranged in a triangle on my left shoulder blade. They look like old burn scars, but I have no memory of being burned. Mom has them too, in exactly the same place. We've never discussed them. Last month, I drove out to visit my parents. Tommy was there with his wife and their new baby. We were all sitting on the back porch after dinner, watching the sun set, when my niece pointed at the sky and said her first word, "Red." We all looked up, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Mom's hand found mine under the table, and I felt her trembling. Tommy's daughter is about the same age I was that night. Sometimes I catch myself watching her, wondering if she sees things in the sky that the rest of us miss. Wondering if whatever it was that visited us that night left something behind, something that gets passed down through the generations, like eye color or the shape of a smile. I still drive out to visit my parents regularly, taking those same back roads through the countryside. And every time I pass that big farm field, I can't help but look up, searching for that deep liquid red in the darkness above. Sometimes on very clear nights, I think I see it, waiting. And sometimes I think it sees me too. Redditor 2. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that autumn evening in North Wales. Anna, my maid of 5 years, was the only other witness, and she quit her job a week after it happened. I don't blame her. Some nights, when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m., I wish I could quit my own memories just as easily. We were driving back from a client meeting in Manchester. I'm an interior designer, and Anna often accompanied me on these trips to help with measurements and material selections. The sunset had painted the sky in deep purples and oranges when we decided to pull over at a lay-by somewhere between Betwizerco and Bala. My legs were cramping from the 3-hour drive, and the cigarette craving had become unbearable, but I couldn't get past the smoking bars. The road curved along the edge of a valley, with dense Welsh forests stretching below us like a dark green carpet. Beyond that, the mountains of Snowdonia rose like sleeping giants against the dying light. It was the kind of view that makes you feel small, insignificant. The kind that reminds you that the world is so much vaster and stranger than we like to pretend. I remember checking my phone at 7:43 p.m. before lighting my cigarette. The smoke curled up into the cooling air, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, maybe from an airplane catching the last rays of sunlight. But airplanes move. This hovered. "Anna," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see that?" She was stretching her legs by the car, but when she looked up, I heard her sharp intake of breath. Above the tree line, maybe half a mile away, hung what I can only describe as a silver cigar. The object was perfectly still, its metallic surface reflecting the sunset with an impossible brightness. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling as I opened the camera app. But each photo showed nothing but lens flare, as if the object was deliberately avoiding being captured. "It's not showing up," I muttered, more to myself than Anna. "Mrs. Harrison?" Anna's voice was barely a whisper. "Perhaps we should leave?" I should have listened to her. That's what keeps me up at night, that I didn't listen. "Just a few more minutes," I said, transfixed by the sight. The cigarette burned, forgotten between my fingers as we watched the object begin to move. It glided over the trees with a silence that felt wrong, somehow, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Time seemed to stretch like taffy. I checked my phone again, 8:16 p.m. We'd been standing there for over 30 minutes and not a single car had passed, on a Welsh air road. In retrospect, that should have been our second warning. The object began to ascend, climbing higher until it disappeared behind the mountains. For a moment, everything was still. The trees had stopped rustling. Even the evening birds had fallen silent. Then we heard it, a mechanical whirring that started as a whisper and grew into a roar. From the valley below, a black helicopter rose like a massive insect. No lights, no markings, just matte black against the darkening sky. It followed the same path as the silver object, vanishing behind the mountains within seconds. Anna was already in the car, her face pale in the growing darkness. "Mrs. Harrison, please." This time I listened. But that wasn't the end of it. No, what happened 3 weeks later made the silver cigar look like a casual afternoon show. I'd been having trouble sleeping since the incident in Wales. My client work was suffering, and my doctor had suggested fresh air and exercise. That's how I ended up agreeing to join some friends for stargazing at Formby Beach. It's a secluded spot north of Liverpool, with sand dunes and pine forests. Perfect for watching the stars, they said. James, an amateur astronomer, had brought his telescope. Kate, his wife, packed hot chocolate and blankets. It should have been peaceful, normal. But as we settled onto our blankets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Look," Kate pointed toward the water. "What are those lights?" 3 white lights, arranged in a perfect triangle, were moving slowly across the Irish Sea. They were too low to be a plane, too steady to be drones. And there was that silence again, that complete, absolute silence that I remembered from Wales. "It's probably just a military exercise," James said, but he wasn't reaching for his telescope. Nobody moved as the triangle of lights changed direction, heading inland, heading toward us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The lights grew larger, and I realized with horrifying certainty that whatever this was, it was massive. The triangle must have been at least 100 meters across. Then it was above us. The stars disappeared, blotted out by something our eyes couldn't quite process. The air felt heavy, electrically charged. My skin tingled, and I tasted metal on my tongue. The same taste I'd had that evening in Wales. The lights went out. I've never moved so fast in my life. My car keys were in my hand before I consciously reached for them. We piled into my BMW and I broke every speed limit between Formby and Liverpool. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? The next morning, James called. His telescope was dead. Not just the battery, but every electronic component had failed. Kate developed a mysterious rash that lasted for weeks, and me, I started noticing things. Small things at first. My compass doesn't point north anymore. Any compass I touch spins wildly for a few seconds before settling on a point somewhere to the east. Electronics malfunction around me. Phones lose signal, watches stop, computers crash. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that whirring sound again, even in central Liverpool. Last week I received a letter. No return address, no signature, just a single sentence. "We know what you saw." I've installed security cameras around my house, but they never seem to work properly. The footage is always corrupted, showing strange artifacts and geometric shapes that shouldn't be there. My new maid quit after 2 days, claiming she saw triangular shadows moving across the walls. I've thought about reporting it all to the authorities, but who would believe me? What would I even say? That I saw something impossible in Wales and now impossible things won't leave me alone? That sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see 3 tiny lights reflected in my eyes, arranged in a perfect triangle? The doctors say there's nothing wrong with me. The therapist suggests it's trauma from some unrelated event manifesting in paranoid delusions. But they didn't see what I saw. They weren't there in that lay-by, in Wales, or on that beach in Formby. Sometimes I drive back to that spot in Wales, hoping to, I don't know what, find answers, prove to myself that it was real. The lay-by is still there, but it looks different now. The trees seem darker, more dense. The mountains feel closer somehow, as if they're slowly creeping forward when no one's watching. And every time I visit, without fail, I hear that helicopter. I never see it anymore, just the sound, growing louder and softer, circling endlessly above the valley. Watching, waiting. Last night, I found a silver, cigar-shaped pendant on my pillow. I never bought it. None of my friends recognize it. And when I try to photograph it, all I get is lens flare. I don't sleep much these days. Instead, I sit by my window, watching the sky. The stars don't look the same anymore. They move in patterns that feel deliberate, meaningful. And sometimes, just before dawn, I see 3 white lights on the horizon, arranged in a perfect triangle. They're getting closer. I know they are. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that one day they'll come back for me. Not because I saw something I shouldn't have, but because what I saw that day saw me too. And it recognized something in me that I am only now beginning to understand. Redditor 3. I've kept this story to myself for 4 years now, not because I didn't want to share it, God knows I've tried, but because every time I start to tell someone, the words get stuck in my throat. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the lingering doubt that anyone would believe me. Or maybe it's because, deep down, I know that what I saw that night changed everything. It was the kind of summer evening that makes you forget all your troubles. You know the type, when the air is perfectly still and the humidity has finally dropped enough that you can breathe without feeling like you're drinking the air. The kind of night that draws you outside just to exist in it. I was standing on my front porch, nursing a glass of iced tea that had long since gone warm. The condensation had left a ring on the porch railing where I'd set it down. My neck was craned back, eyes fixed on the vast expanse above. The stars were particularly brilliant that night, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. Every few minutes I'd catch the familiar sight of airplanes crossing the sky, their red lights blinking steadily as they carved predictable paths through the darkness. I'd always been fascinated by the night sky. As a kid, I'd spend hours with my dad's old telescope, mapping constellations and dreaming about what might be out there. But that night, something was different. Something was wrong. At first, I almost missed it. A peculiar shade of red, orange light peeking over the tree line on the horizon. It reminded me of the way the sun looks through heavy smoke, but this was nearly midnight, and there hadn't been any reports of fires in the area. The light was moving, steadily and purposefully, in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. I tried to rationalize it, the way we all do when confronted with something that doesn't fit into our understanding of reality. Maybe it was a helicopter, a drone, some kind of military aircraft I'd never seen before. But as it drew closer, I knew I was lying to myself. The light was too large, too bright, and moving far too quickly to be anything I could explain away. For about 90 seconds, I stood frozen, watching it traverse the sky. My warm tea sat forgotten on the railing, and I noticed my hands had started to tremble. The crickets, which had been providing their usual summer symphony, had fallen silent. Even the air felt different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. A thought flashed through my mind. I should get my camera. It was sitting on my desk, just inside the house, barely 20 feet away. I could document this, prove to myself and others that I wasn't losing my mind. That's when everything changed. The moment, the very instant, that thought formed in my mind, the light stopped. Not gradually, not with any sense of deceleration, it just stopped, hanging there in the sky like a suspended drop of molten metal. And then, it moved. I've spent 4 years trying to find the right words to describe what I saw next. Imagine watching a master fencer practice their forms. but compressed into 3 seconds and performed with impossible precision. The light zigzagged across a patch of sky roughly the size of my outstretched hand, changing direction at least 10 times. Each turn was instantaneous, defying every law of physics I knew. There was no arc, no curve, just sharp, impossible angles traced in burning red-orange against the night sky. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, it shot off in its original direction. 5 seconds later, it had vanished completely, leaving nothing but a violet afterimage dancing in my vision and a deep, unsettling silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, but my phone later told me it was only 20 minutes. The crickets slowly resumed their chorus. A plane blinked its way across the sky, following its proper, predictable path. Everything seemed normal again, except nothing would ever be normal again. That night marked the beginning of changes in my life that I'm only now starting to understand. The first thing I noticed was the dreams. They started the very next night. Vivid, technicolor visions that felt more like memories than dreams. In them, I'm always standing on my porch, but instead of watching the light is watching me. I can feel its attention, its interest, its purpose. Then came the power fluctuations. Small things at first, my phone battery draining unusually quickly, light bulbs burning out more frequently than they should. But it escalated. Some nights, every electronic device in my house would turn on simultaneously, screens flickering with static, before shutting down just as abruptly. The power company couldn't find any problems with the lines, and an electrician said my house's wiring was perfectly fine. I started noticing patterns in random things. Numbers on license plates would add up to specific sequences. Songs on shuffle would play in an order that seemed to convey messages. I'd wake up at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night, drawn to my window by a compulsion I couldn't explain, but there was never anything there, just that familiar feeling of being watched, studied, measured. The strangest part? My camera, the one I'd thought about getting that night, hasn't worked since. It powers on fine, but every picture comes out distorted, covered in strange artifacts that look almost like writing in a language I've never seen. The camera store says there's nothing wrong with it mechanically. They suggested I buy a new one, but somehow, I know any camera I buy will do the same thing. I've tried to research similar experiences, spent countless hours on forums and websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena. Some stories come close, but none quite match what I saw. The few times I've worked up the courage to share my story online, the posts mysteriously disappear within hours. Comments vanish. Entire threads get wiped clean. 4 years later, I still spend my evenings on that porch, watching the sky. The red-orange light hasn't returned, but something has changed in the way I see the world. It's like once you glimpse behind the curtain of reality, you can't help but notice the shadows moving behind it. The stars don't look quite the same anymore. They seem closer somehow, more immediate, more aware. Sometimes, on particularly clear nights, I'll catch a reflection in my tea glass that doesn't match the sky above, or I'll notice that my shadow falls in a direction that doesn't quite align with any visible light source. Small things, things that could be dismissed or explained away, but I know better now. I know that what I saw that summer night wasn't just a light in the sky. It was a glimpse of something vast and incomprehensible, something that noticed me noticing it. And sometimes, in my quieter moments, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to return. Every time I see a plane's blinking red lights crossing the night sky now, I hold my breath for a moment, wondering if this time the light will stop. If this time it will start to move in those impossible angles again. Part of me hopes it will. Part of me is terrified it will. Because deep down, I know that whatever I saw that night wasn't just passing by. It was searching for something, and I'm no longer certain whether I was the one observing it or if it was the other way around. These days, I keep my camera close, even though I know it won't work. I keep my phone charged, even though I know it might suddenly drain. And I keep telling myself that what I saw that night was just a light in the sky. But we both know that's not true. Because sometimes, late at night, when the world is perfectly still and the stars are at their brightest, I can feel it. That same electric charge in the air. That same heavy silence. that same sense of being watched, measured, studied. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that whatever I saw that night wasn't just passing through. It found what it was looking for. And sometimes, in those moments between sleeping and waking, I catch myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, what it found was me. Redditor 4. I wish I could blame it all on nicotine withdrawal. That's what the doctor suggested when I finally broke down and sought help. Hallucinations can be a side effect of quitting, they said. But Sarah saw it too, and Sarah's been dead for 3 months now. It started during an evening shift at Lorenzo's, this little Italian place tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store. The kind of restaurant where the owner still makes his mother's tiramisu recipe and knows every regular by name. I'd been working there for about 2 years, long enough to develop that sixth sense servers get, knowing which tables need refills before they ask, which couples are on awkward first dates, which businessmen will stiff you on the tip. The dinner rush had just died down, and my section was clear, except for a couple lingering over their dessert. Sarah caught my eye from across the restaurant and tapped her pocket, our universal signal for a smoke break. I nodded, grabbed my pack of Marlboros from my apron, and headed for the back door. The night air was crisp for September, just cool enough to make me wish I'd grabbed my jacket. Sarah was already lighting up when I pushed through the heavy metal door into our little smoking area, really just a strip of concrete between the dumpster and the chain-link fence that separated us from the empty lot next door. The skies were unusually clear that night, stars twinkling above us like tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. "Did you see that guy at table 12? Sarah asked, exhaling a stream of smoke. "The one who sent his pasta back 3 times? I laughed, fishing my lighter out of my pocket. Yeah, what was his deal? The sauce was too red the first time, not red enough the second time? Some people just live to make others miserable, she said, leaning against the brick wall. Her blonde hair caught the yellow glow from the security light, creating a halo effect that made her look almost angelic. Funny how clear that detail remains in my memory, considering what happened next. That's when we saw it, a light in the sky, moving steadily across our field of vision. At first, I didn't think much of it. Living near the regional airport, we were used to seeing all kinds of aircraft. Based on the trajectory and height, maybe 5,000 or 7,000 feet up, I figured it was probably a helicopter, though I couldn't hear the usual thump-thump of rotor blades. Probably police chopper, I said, taking another drag, looking for someone who... The words died in my throat as the light suddenly dropped. Not descended, dropped, like a stone in a pond. 1 second it was cruising along its path, the next it plummeted straight down at impossible speed. Then, just as abruptly, it hooked left, shot back up at an angle that would have turned any human pilot to jelly, and vanished into the night sky faster than anything I'd ever seen. My cigarette fell from my numb fingers. Sarah and I stood there, jaws hanging open, staring at the empty space where the impossible had just happened. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds, we turned to look at each other. "Did you?" I started. "Yeah," she whispered. "What the fuck was that?" Before I could answer, a sound cut through the night, a high-pitched whine just at the edge of hearing, like the noise a TV makes when it's on mute. It made my teeth ache and set my skin crawling. Sarah pressed her hands against her ears. "Let's get inside," I said, already reaching for the door, but as I pulled the handle, I realized something was wrong. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, panic rising in my throat. The handle was ice cold against my palm, despite the mild temperature. "Try your key," Sarah suggested, her voice tight with tension. I fumbled in my apron pocket, pulled out my key ring, and nearly dropped it as the whining sound intensified. The security light above us flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness broken only by the distant glow of streetlights. That's when we saw the second light. It started as a pain point in the empty lot next door, hovering about 6 feet off the ground. As we watched, frozen in place, it began to expand, not like a spotlight being turned on, but like something opening. The light seemed to fold outward, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to look at, geometric shapes that shouldn't have been possible in 3-dimensional space. "Run!" Sarah whispered, but neither of us moved. I'm not sure we could have if we tried. The whining had become a pulse now, synchronizing with my heartbeat, making my vision blur at the edges. The light continued to unfold, and within it, something moved. A shadow, or maybe multiple shadows, their edges too sharp and angles too wrong. They shifted and flowed like liquid darkness, and as they moved, I felt something probe at the edges of my mind. Alien thoughts. Concepts that human consciousness wasn't meant to process. I remember fragments of what happened next. Sarah screaming, a smell like ozone and burning metal, a sensation of being turned inside out while remaining perfectly still. The shadows reached for us with appendages that weren't quite arms, leaving trails in the air like tears in reality itself. The next thing I clearly remember is waking up on the concrete, my head pounding, the taste of copper in my mouth. The security light was back on, the door was unlocked, and Sarah was gone. The police found her car still in the parking lot, her purse still in her locker, her phone still charging behind the bar. They searched the empty lot, but there was nothing to find except a perfect circle of dead grass about 20 feet in diameter. They questioned me for hours, but what could I tell them? The truth would have landed me in a padded cell. 3 weeks later, Sarah's body appeared in that same empty lot. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death. There were no marks on her body, no signs of trauma or disease. She was just empty, like a shell someone had scraped clean from the inside out. The only unusual finding was a series of geometric patterns burned into her retinas, patterns that, according to the examiner's report, couldn't have been created by any known method. I quit smoking that day. Quit my job too. Moved across the state, changed my phone number, did everything I could to put that night behind me. But it didn't matter, they found me anyway. It starts the same way every time, that high-pitched whine just at the edge of hearing, then the cold, spreading through my walls like frost no matter how high I turn up the heat. Sometimes I see lights in the sky, moving in ways that defy physics and reason. Sometimes I catch glimpses of shadows that fold in on themselves like origami made of darkness. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see Sarah. She tries to tell me something, her mouth moving in patterns that mirror those impossible geometries, but I always wake up before I can understand. Maybe that's for the best. There are some things humans aren't meant to comprehend. Last night, I heard the whining again. When I looked out my window, I saw a circle of dead grass forming in my backyard, spreading outward like a time-lapse video of decay. I should run, but what's the point? You can't hide from something that can fold space like paper, that can reach into your mind and rearrange your thoughts like furniture. So I'm writing this down, not as a warning, it's far too late for that, but as a record. If you're reading this, it means they've finally come back for me. And if you ever find yourself working a late shift, and you step out back for a smoke break, and you see a light in the sky moving just a little too strangely, don't look up, don't try to understand, just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and pray they didn't notice you noticing them. But they probably did. They always do. And if you hear that whine, that barely there sound that makes your teeth ache and your thoughts scatter, well, then it's already too late. Just like it was for Sarah, just like it is for me. I hear it now, actually, getting louder. The walls are growing cold, and the shadows in the corners of my room are beginning to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. I should be terrified, but instead I feel an almost peaceful resignation. At least I'll finally know where Sarah went. At least I'll understand what she's been trying to tell me in my dreams. The light is starting to unfold. Goodbye. Redditor 5. I've spent 20 years trying to convince myself that what I saw that night was just the product of an overactive childhood imagination. But some things don't fade with time, like those impossible colors that still haunt my dreams. Colors that shouldn't exist. Colors that don't exist, at least not in our world. I was 10 years old, curled up in my favorite spot on the bay window, lost in one of those dog-eared Hardy Boys mysteries. My mom had already called up twice about bedtime, but I'd mastered the art of reading by streetlight, angling my book just right so the yellow glow from outside caught the pages perfectly. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 9:47 p.m., late enough that the neighborhood had gone quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. My bedroom was on the second floor of our suburban home in Massachusetts, giving me a perfect view of the night sky above the rooftops. It was one of those clear autumn nights where the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the air had that crisp edge that made everything feel more alive somehow. The kind of night where anything seemed possible. I remember the exact moment I first noticed something was off. The words on my page suddenly seemed dimmer, as if something was slowly eclipsing the streetlight. That's when I saw the reflection in my window, hints of color playing across the glass like an oil slick in the rain. But these weren't normal colors. They moved wrong. They felt wrong. When I looked up, I saw them, lights in the sky, moving with deliberate purpose straight upward. The familiar colors were there, deep crimson red, electric blue, and an almost toxic green. But between them, around them, were others, colors that made my eyes hurt trying to focus on them. One seemed to pulse between purple and something else, something that my brain couldn't quite process. Another reminded me of gold. But if gold could somehow be a sound instead of a color, even now, trying to describe them feels like trying to explain what water tastes like to someone who's never had a drink. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I scrambled for the cheap plastic binoculars I kept by my bed. They were a birthday present from my uncle, barely better than toys, but I'd spent countless nights watching planes and trying to spot satellites with them. By the time I got them focused, the lights were already too distant, rising faster than anything I'd ever seen move through the sky before. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, just long enough to burn itself permanently into my memory, but not long enough to wake my parents or alert the neighbors. When it was over, the night felt different, heavier somehow, like the air itself had changed. I told myself it was nothing. I was tired, my eyes were strained from reading in bad light, and I'd probably just seen the northern lights or some weird atmospheric phenomenon. That's what my parents said when I tried to tell them about it the next morning. That's what I kept telling myself for years afterward. But the dreams started that night. They always begin the same way. I'm back in my childhood bedroom, but everything's slightly wrong. The walls are too tall, the window too wide, and outside, those colors wait for me. In the dreams, they have weight, they have intention, and they remember me just as clearly as I remember them. I started noticing other things too. Small things at first. The way certain shadows seemed to linger a bit too long after sunset. The way birds would sometimes fall silent in mid-song when I walked beneath them. The way my computer screen would occasionally flicker with hints of those impossible colors when I was alone late at night. By the time I started college, I'd convinced myself it was all just an overactive imagination combined with an early onset of anxiety. I even saw a therapist for a while who helped me develop coping mechanisms for what she called intrusive thoughts. It worked, mostly. The dreams became less frequent, the shadows less threatening. Then came last Tuesday night. I was driving home from a late meeting, taking the back roads to avoid highway traffic. It was another clear autumn night, so similar to that one 20 years ago that it made my skin prickle with déjà vu. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show about conspiracy theories that I wasn't really listening to. That's when my car's electrical system went haywire. The dashboard lights flickered and died, the radio dissolved into static, even my phone screen went black, and in that moment of complete darkness, I saw them again. Those same impossible colors, now dancing across my windshield like Aurora Borealis gone wrong. I pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the steering wheel. Above me, the lights were back, but closer this time, much closer. The oval shape I'd thought I'd seen as a child was clearer now. Not quite solid, more like a tear in the fabric of the night sky, bleeding colors that shouldn't exist into our world. As I sat there, paralyzed between fascination and terror, I noticed something I hadn't seen as a child: patterns in the lights. They weren't random. They were repeating, cycling through sequences that seemed almost familiar, like a language written in chromatic frequencies instead of words. And then I realized they were repeating the exact pattern from 20 years ago. They'd been looking for something that night, looking for me, and now they'd found me again. My car's engine roared back to life without me touching the key. The radio cleared, but instead of the talk show, there was only a high-pitched tone that made my teeth ache. And underneath it, almost too quiet to hear, a voice, my voice, from 20 years ago, reading aloud from that Hardy Boys book in my bay window. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, taking corners too fast, running stop signs, desperate to get home. The lights followed, keeping pace easily, their impossible colors reflecting off every window and metallic surface I passed. Other cars on the road didn't seem to notice them. Or maybe they couldn't see them at all. I made it home somehow, locked every door and window, and huddled in my bedroom until dawn. When the sun finally rose, everything seemed normal again. My phone worked, my car started fine, the world went about its business as if nothing had happened. But I know better now. Those lights, those colors, they're still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I catch myself going back to that moment in my childhood bedroom, wondering what would have happened if I'd been just a little quicker with those binoculars, if I'd seen what was really behind those lights. Because here's the thing about impossible colors. Once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. They change the way you look at everything. They make you question what else might be out there, just beyond the edge of what our human eyes can perceive. What other impossible things might be watching us from just outside our understanding? I still have those old binoculars somewhere, buried in a box in my closet. Sometimes I'm tempted to dig them out, to sit by my window and wait just like I did when I was 10. But I won't, because deep down, I know something now that my 10-year-old self didn't. Sometimes, when you look up at the stars look back, and sometimes they recognize you. Last night, I saw those colors again, reflected in my bathroom mirror, just for a second, just at the corner of my eye. But this time, they were closer than ever before. And this time, I swear they whispered my name. Redditor 6. I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of what we saw. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it, write it off as some military test or atmospheric anomaly. But deep down, I know better. My brother Jake knows it too, though we rarely talk about it anymore. Some things just don't fit into the neat little boxes we use to explain our world. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind where autumn's chill hasn't quite given way to winter's bite. Jake had just picked me up from my late shift at the hospital in his beat-up Jeep Wrangler, the one with the squeaky suspension that announced our presence long before we arrived anywhere. The dashboard clock read 11:17 p.m., its red digits casting a faint glow across the worn leather interior. "Thanks for the ride," I said, settling into the passenger seat. My car's still in the shop. The transmission had been acting up, and on a nurse's salary, car repairs always seem to come at the worst possible time. Jake just nodded, focused on the road ahead. That was his way, quiet, methodical, always watching. He'd been like that since we were kids, the observer to my chatterer. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night talk show host droning on about conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. Usually, I'd ask him to change it, but tonight, the white noise was oddly comforting. We took the long way home, Route 23, a stretched-out ribbon of asphalt that curved through patches of woodland before straightening out for miles. The trees were sparse enough to see the sky, but thick enough to make you feel small, their branches reaching overhead like gnarled fingers against the starlit canvas. At first, I didn't notice them. I was too busy checking my phone, 2% battery, typical, when Jake's hand suddenly gripped my arm. "Emma," he said, his voice tight, "look up." I did, and there they were. Two perfectly circular white lights hovering in the sky, maybe a half-mile ahead. They weren't aircraft warning lights which blink in steady patterns. These were different. Solid, unwavering, like two full moons that had somehow broken free from gravity's pull. "What do you think?" I started to ask, but Jake was already easing off the accelerator. The Jeep's engine growled lower as we slowed from 60 to 40, then 30. The lights remained stationary, floating at what seemed like a few hundred feet above the tree line. My heart started to pound, that familiar flutter of adrenaline I usually only felt during emergency room chaos. I tried to rationalize it. Drones maybe, or some kind of weather balloon? but drones don't hover that high, and weather balloons don't emit that kind of steady, piercing light. Should we stop? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why was I whispering? There was nobody else around for miles. Jake didn't answer immediately. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he guided the Jeep toward a gravel turnout near an old railroad crossing. The crossing gates were up, their striped arms stark against the darkness, and the metal rails gleamed dully in our headlights. The engine idled roughly as we sat there, its vibrations traveling up through the seats. The lights remained fixed in position, like they were waiting, watching. I fumbled for my phone, wanting to record what we were seeing, but of course, dead battery. Just my luck. We should get closer, Jake said finally, putting the Jeep in gear. He made a 3-point turn on the gravel, the tires crunching loudly in the silence. As we started back toward the lights, something changed. The movement was impossible. That's the only word I can use to describe it. 1 second, the lights were there, perfectly still, and the next, they were streaking across the horizon at a speed that defied physics. They didn't gradually accelerate. They simply changed position, like someone had drawn a line of light across the sky. But here's the thing that still haunts me. They didn't move like anything in our world moves. It wasn't like watching a shooting star or a jet breaking the sound barrier. The lights seemed to travel along a completely different plane of existence, as if they were sliding across a sheet of glass that intersected with our reality at an impossible angle. Jake slammed on the brakes and we both lurched forward against our seatbelts. "Did you?" he started. "Yeah," I breathed. "I saw it." We sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, scanning the sky for any trace of the lights. The night had reclaimed its ordinary darkness, but something felt fundamentally wrong, like reality had shifted slightly out of alignment. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio dial, needing something, anything, to break the silence. Static burst through the speakers, a harsh burst of white noise that made us both jump. I quickly turned it off, but not before catching what sounded like words buried in the interference, or at least something that might have been words in a language I couldn't begin to comprehend. "We should go," Jake said, but he didn't move to start driving. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where the lights had vanished. "Emma, we should really go." I noticed then that the temperature had dropped dramatically. My breath was visible in small clouds, and frost was starting to form at the corners of the windshield. In October. In Tennessee. The railroad crossing gates suddenly started to lower, their bells clanging in the silence. Jake and I exchanged glances. We hadn't heard a train approaching, and the tracks weren't exactly busy at this time of night. The warning lights began to flash, red pulses that illuminated the surrounding trees in crimson bursts. But there was no train. The gates finished their descent, and we sat there, engine idling, as the bells continued their urgent warning. Through the windshield, I could see the tracks vibrating slightly, sending small pebbles dancing across the rails. The air felt charged, like just before a massive thunderstorm. "Jake," I said, my voice cracking. "Jake, we need to—" The lights reappeared, not in the sky this time, but on the tracks themselves, floating about 6 feet above the rails. They were brighter now, almost painfully so, and they seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm that made my teeth ache. Jake threw the Jeep into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel. I grabbed the dashboard as we backed away, my ears popping from a sudden change in pressure. The lights began to move again, but this time they were coming toward us, still maintaining that perfect, impossible geometry. What happened next still doesn't make sense, no matter how many times I try to explain it. The lights didn't just move closer. They seemed to fold space around themselves, like they were bending the very fabric of reality. Trees in their path didn't illuminate as they should have. Instead, they seemed to ripple, as if we were viewing them through waves of intense heat. Jake managed to turn the Jeep around and we sped away, the engine roaring in protest as he pushed it well beyond any safe speed for these roads. I kept looking back, watching as the lights grew smaller in the distance, but they never fully disappeared. They just seemed to recede into some other dimension, leaving behind a visual distortion that took hours to fade from my vision. We didn't stop until we reached the outskirts of town, pulling into an all-night diner where we sat in silence, drinking coffee that neither of us really wanted. The fluorescent lights and laminated menus provided a desperately needed anchor to normality, but we both knew something had fundamentally changed. That was 3 months ago. Since then, we've tried to research what we saw, spending countless hours online and in the library looking for similar accounts. We've found some, enough to know we're not alone in what we witnessed, but nothing that fully explains it. The railroad crossing where it happened is different now. Electronics malfunction within a half-mile radius. Compasses spin wildly, GPS signals scramble and redirect to impossible locations. Even the trees seem changed, growing in subtle but wrong angles, their branches reaching towards something we can't see. Jake and I drive that road sometimes, late at night when we can't sleep. We never stop anymore, but we watch the sky, looking for those lights. Part of me hopes we never see them again. A larger part knows we will. Because here's the thing about that night. I don't think we witnessed something entering our world. I think, for a brief moment, we saw the seam where our reality meets another, a glimpse through a window we were never meant to see. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that strange language buried in radio static, trying to tell us something we're not ready to understand. The local paper ran a small article a week later about unusual magnetic disturbances in the area. The official explanation blamed solar flares and atmospheric conditions, but Jake and I know better. We saw what we saw. And sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I catch myself looking for those lights again, both hoping and fearing they'll return, because deep down I know they're still out there, moving across planes of existence we can barely comprehend, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I just hope we never find out what they're waiting for. Redditor 7. I've been trying to write this down for weeks now. My hands still shake when I think about it, but I need to get this out. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. Maybe then I'll stop seeing those impossibly long fingers reaching for my window every time I close my eyes. It started on a Tuesday night in October. I remember because I'd been procrastinating on a work presentation, the kind that could make or break your career. The clock on my laptop read 11:43 p.m., and I was settled into my favorite spot in the house, an old leather armchair facing the backyard's sliding glass door. There's something comforting about working late at night, watching your reflection ghosted against the darkness beyond the glass, the soft glow of the screen creating this intimate bubble of light and warmth. The first tap was so gentle I almost missed it, like a raindrop hitting the glass, except the forecast hadn't mentioned rain. The second tap made me look up from my spreadsheets, and that's when I saw it. A hand pulling away from the door. But calling it a hand feels wrong, like calling a wolf a dog or a shark a fish. The fingers were impossibly long, each one the length of my entire hand, and the skin, God, the skin. It was this sickly gray-purple color, like a bruise that had somehow learned to move. I remember thinking, this isn't real. I'm tired, I've had too much coffee. But then those fingers pressed against the glass again, and I watched them leave smudges that caught the light from my laptop. 5 perfect prints, each one stretching nearly a foot long. My body reacted before my mind could process what I was seeing. I launched myself out of the chair, sending my laptop crashing to the floor. In the 3 seconds it took me to scramble to my feet, whatever was on the other side of that glass had vanished. No movement in the bushes, no rustling of leaves, just the empty darkness of my backyard staring back at me. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the house blazing, huddled on my living room couch, as far from any windows as I could get. I told myself I'd imagined it, that stress and exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. But those fingerprints remained on the glass until morning, only fading when the sun hit them directly, like frost melting away. That should have been the end of it, a strange, frightening experience to tell at parties, nothing more. But 3 nights later, everything changed. I'd finally managed to get back to something resembling a normal sleep schedule, though I'd moved my workspace to the kitchen table, well away from any sliding glass doors. That night, I drifted off around midnight, and what happened next still makes me question everything I thought I knew about reality. It started as sleep paralysis, or at least that's what I told myself at first. You know that sensation of being awake but unable to move? Except this time I felt weightless, like I was floating a few inches above my bed. The room looked different, bathed in a soft, silvery light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I realized I could see myself lying there, perfectly still, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. I was having an out-of-body experience, and instead of feeling terrified, I felt peaceful, curious even. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone. They stood at the foot of my bed, two figures that had to be at least 8 feet tall. Their faces were eerily human-like but refined, perfected, as if someone had taken all the best features of humanity and sculpted them in celestial clay. Their skin glowed with a faint, pearlescent sheen, and their eyes held galaxies. But what took my breath away were their wings. They unfurled from their backs like living aurora borealis, shifting and shimmering with colors I'd never seen before. Colors that shouldn't exist in our spectrum. These weren't the feathered wings of classical angels or the bat-like wings of demons. These were something else entirely, something that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. One of them, the taller one, smiled at me, and I felt a warmth spread through whatever passed for my body in this state. They didn't speak, not with words, but I felt their thoughts brush against my consciousness like silk against skin. "We've been watching," they seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you to see us." The shorter one reached out, and for a moment I saw their hands shift, elongate, fingers stretching into those impossible lengths I'd seen at my door. My heart should have stopped right there, but somehow I understood. They had been trying to make contact, to bridge the gap between their reality and mine, but their true forms were too alien for our physical world. They guided me through what felt like layers of reality, showing me things I still struggle to put into words. Cities made of living crystal, beings of pure light and thought, dimensions folded into themselves like infinite origami. Time meant nothing in their presence. It could have been minutes or millennia. When I woke the next morning, I was back in my bed, sunlight streaming through my windows like any other day. But there were marks on my ceiling. 5 long parallel lines in that same gray-purple color, already fading in the morning light. I've spent weeks researching, trying to make sense of what happened. I've found others who've had similar experiences, who've seen those beautiful, terrible beings or those reaching hands. Some call them aliens, others angels, and some believe there's something else entirely. Entities that exist in the spaces between what we can perceive and what we can comprehend. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't fear anymore, it's anticipation. Because every now and then, when I'm sitting alone in the dark, I'll catch a glimpse of shifting colors at the edge of my vision, or feel a gentle tap on my window. And part of me wants to answer, to see what lies beyond that glass door again. But there's another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, that whispers a warning. Maybe those beautiful beings weren't showing me their world at all. Maybe they were showing me what they wanted me to see, because sometimes in my dreams I still see those long gray-purple fingers, reaching, always reaching, and I wonder what they're really trying to grasp. Last night I found new marks on my ceiling, fresh ones, and this time they haven't faded with the morning light. I think they're coming back, and I'm not sure I want to be here when they do. Redditor 8. I've spent 20 years trying to convince myself that what I saw that night was just ball lightning. That's what rational people do, right? They find explanations for the inexplicable. They don't let their minds wander to darker possibilities. But lately, the dreams have been getting worse, and I need to write this down. Maybe then I'll finally stop seeing that ethereal blue glow every time I closed my eyes. I was 13 when it happened, living with my mom and stepdad in one of those gleaming Manhattan high-rises that pierce the clouds. The 33rd floor, high enough to feel disconnected from the world below, but not so high that you couldn't still make out the tiny figures of people scurrying along the sidewalks like ants. Our apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows in the dining room, offering a panoramic view of the city's eastern side. Mom always said we were lucky to have such a view, but sometimes, especially during storms, it felt more like living in a glass cage, suspended in the sky. That night, Mom was working late at the hospital. She often pulled double shifts in the ER, and my stepdad, Richard, was home with me. We were having dinner, or rather, I was picking at my microwaved mac and cheese while he read through some classified documents he'd brought home. That was normal for us. Richard had been an Air Force pilot during the Cold War, flying U-2 spy planes over places he never talked about. Even years after retiring, he maintained that military precision, that careful attention to detail that made him seem more like a machine than a man, sometimes. The sky outside was heavy with storm clouds, that peculiar shade of greenish-gray that makes everything feel slightly wrong. I remember the static electricity in the air, how it made the hair on my arms stand up. The weather report had predicted severe thunderstorms, but so far the sky just brooded, holding its breath. I was absently staring out the window, fork suspended halfway to my mouth, when I saw it. At first I thought it was a reflection, maybe headlights from a helicopter, but then it took shape, a perfect sphere of electric blue light hovering at what seemed to be eye level with our floor. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest hurt, like looking at something you're not supposed to see. The orb pulsed gently, almost like it was breathing, and it moved with a slight wobble that seemed almost deliberate. "Richard," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Richard, look." He didn't respond immediately, still absorbed in his papers. The orb continued its gentle dance outside our window, and I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch the glass, to try to make contact with whatever this thing was. My fingertips were inches from the window when Richard finally looked up. The change in his expression is something I'll never forget. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never seen him show fear. Concern, yes. Anger, definitely. But this was different. His face went slack, and the coffee mug he was holding slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. "Don't move," he said, his voice tight. "Don't touch the window." The orb suddenly stopped its wobbling motion, becoming perfectly still. It was as if it had heard him, as if it was listening. Then, in a movement so fast my eyes couldn't track it, it shot eastward and simply ceased to exist. Not like something flying away into the distance, but like a light being switched off, leaving nothing but the afterimage burning in my retinas. Thunder cracked overhead, making me jump, and fat raindrops began to splatter against the windows. Richard was already moving, pulling down all the blinds with quick, efficient movements. He cleaned up the broken mug without saying a word, his hands steady, but his face pale. "Ball lightning," he said finally, dropping the ceramic shards into the trash. "That's all it was. Natural phenomenon, rare, but documented." I wanted to believe him. Part of me still wants to believe him, but it's what happened after that makes me question everything about that night. Later, after he thought I was asleep, I heard him on the phone in his study. The walls in our apartment were thick, but if you pressed your ear against the right spot near the air vent, you could hear conversations clearly. I'd discovered this by accident months earlier and had used it to eavesdrop on plenty of boring adult conversations. But this one was different. "It found us," he was saying, his voice barely controlled. "Yes, the same configuration as Tehran 78. No, she saw it too. I know what the protocols are, damn it, but she's my stepdaughter." "Fine, yes, I understand." "Tomorrow, then." The next day, Richard was gone before I woke up. Mom said he'd been called away on urgent business, something about consulting for his old military contacts. He was gone for 3 weeks, and when he came back, he was different. The precision was still there, but there was a new tension in him, like a wire pulled too tight. He never mentioned that night again, and when I tried to bring it up, he'd change the subject, or suddenly remember an urgent errand. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch him standing at the dining room windows, staring out at the sky with an expression I couldn't read. And sometimes he'd tell stories about his time flying U-2S, stories that seemed designed to sound like jokes about UFOs and strange lights in the stratosphere. "Just messing with you, kid," he'd say with a forced laugh, but his eyes would dart to the windows, checking the sky. The dreams started a month after the incident. In them, I'm back in that dining room, but I'm alone. The blue orb appears, larger than before, and this time when it wobbles, it forms patterns, shapes, letters maybe, in a language I almost understand. And there's always a moment just before I wake up when I realize I'm not looking at the orb from inside the apartment, I'm looking at our windows from outside, floating 33 stories above Manhattan. Last week I found a box of Richard's old things in Mom's storage unit. He passed away 3 years ago, heart attack they said, though he had no history of cardiac issues. Among his papers was a sealed envelope with my name on it, to be opened when the time is right. Inside was a single sheet of paper with coordinates and a date. Tomorrow night. The location is in upstate New York, far from city lights. The date? Well, it's exactly 20 years since that night on the 33rd floor. There's also a message written in Richard's precise handwriting. They weren't all lies. Be there if you want the truth. Watch the sky. I've already packed my car. Mom thinks I'm going camping with friends. Better that way. I don't know what I'll find at those coordinates, if anything. Maybe this is Richard's final way of messing with me, one last elaborate joke from beyond the grave. Maybe I'll spend a cold night staring at empty sky, feeling foolish. But here's the thing about that night 20 years ago. Ball lightning doesn't move the way that orb did. Ball lightning doesn't make retired Air Force pilots break their coffee mugs and place mysterious phone calls. And ball lightning doesn't leave you with dreams that feel more like memories. Memories of being on the wrong side of a window 33 stories up. So I'm going, and I'm writing this down now before I leave because, well, just in case. If you're reading this and I haven't added an epilogue, then maybe you can help me figure out what really happened that night. Or maybe you've seen something similar yourself. A strange blue light in the sky, moving in ways that nothing should move. If you do see it, don't touch the window. Whatever you do, don't reach out to make contact. That's what they want. I know that now. The coordinates are, I've learned enough from Richard to know some things shouldn't be shared too widely. But I'll be there tomorrow night, watching the sky, waiting to see if whatever it was that found us on the 33rd floor 20 years ago is finally ready to make contact again. This time, I won't look away.